Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us today. Over the last couple of months, we've seen organizing and community at its best. Hundreds and thousands of individuals who have been leaning their shoulder to bend the moral arc of the universe toward justice. We've seen new corporations and new partners loudly proclaiming Black Lives Matter. But it has to go beyond the statement. To this end, next week, SHOT will release the Loving Cities Index, an assessment on how cities across the country can begin to provide the supports necessary as they think about defunding police, removing the police out of schools, and how to use those resources to truly show that Black Lives Matter. And investing those resources in housing affordability, transportation, and the things that build the types of loving systems where all students can have a fair and substantive opportunity to learn. But in doing that, we also have to know our price. That's why today we are glad to have with us my friend and colleague, Dr. Andre Perry. Dr. Perry has written a book that is enlightening and timely for such a time as this. So I'm happy about the conversation that we're about to have. Leading that conversation is SHOT's Vice President of Programs and Advocacy, Edgar Villanueva. So I just ask that you participate in the discussion and keep leaning your shoulder toward bending the moral arc toward justice. Edgar, take it away.
Thank you, John. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining our conversation today. Before we jump in, I just want to provide a few housekeeping tips for everyone watching the conversation. We encourage you to use the chat feature to connect with one another, post questions. We will save time at the end of our conversation to pull in some questions from participants today. So we encourage you to do that. We also want to share that the webinar will be recorded so that we can repost the conversation to our website for future reference. We also would like to invite you to tweet your thoughts and your questions using the SHOT handle, which is @ShotFound, SCHOTTFOUND, using the hashtag #KnowYourPrice. As John shared, we're living in an unprecedented time, even as communities of color are reeling from the devastating impact of COVID-19. Waves of change are cascading across the country as communities demand an end to militarized police violence towards Black people and in Black communities. Nationwide protests against police violence and white supremacy have garnered new levels of public attention and strengthened the political will for swift and bold action. Just days after the murder of George Floyd, the Minneapolis Public School Board voted unanimously to end its decades-long contract with the police department. And this sparked a ripple effect of school districts across the country calling for the removal of police from classrooms and hallways that were meant for learning, not incarceration. It's really important for all of us to understand, however, that this incredible wave of change did not just happen overnight. Movements for education justice, racial justice, economic justice have been seeding change in local communities, school districts, and national halls of policymaking for decades. That's why this moment is so timely for the voice and thought leadership of Dr. Andre Perry and his new book, Know Your Price, Valuing Black Lives and Property in America's Black Cities. This book shows us a new means of determining the value of Black communities, rejecting policies shaped by flawed perspectives of the past and present. Andre offers fresh insights into the historical efforts or historical effects of racism and constructs a new value paradigm to limit them in the future. Know Your Price is fantastic, y'all. I spent the whole weekend just tearing through this book. It's amazing. I highly recommend it. It demonstrates the worth of Black people's intrinsic personal strengths, real property, and traditional institutions. Andre is a fellow at the Metropolitan Policy Program at the Brookings Institution. Before his work at Brookings, he has been a founding dean, a professor, an award-winning journalist, and an activist in the field of education. Andre, good to see you. Looking forward to speaking with you today.
Well, thanks for having me, and want to thank John for that wonderful introduction as well.
Great. Well, I am really excited to dig in with you today. I think this might be the first time I've actually kind of interviewed an author. And so this is just going to be fun. I look forward to it. I would love to just start the conversation off by hearing from you about why you wrote the book. Why did you write Know Your Price?
Well, as a lot of folks will know from your work and the work of the Schott Foundation, that I've been knee deep in education reform, in particular in New Orleans. I was a charter school leader at the time during or after Hurricane Katrina for a few years. And one of the mantras we wanted to do is to increase test scores. And to a certain extent, the architects of reform in New Orleans used those test scores to justify changes in the landscape in New Orleans. So before charter organizations really landed in New Orleans, right after the storm in December after the storm, 7,500 employees were fired. But then shortly after, when more charter schools entered the space, you saw less and less teachers rehired by charter leaders. And that, when I started to see that, I started to say, hey, there's something wrong with this picture. We go to school so that we can have better communities, so folks can get jobs. And if you're in a Black majority city and you graduate from New Orleans, the crowding out of jobs by largely out-of-town white folks really limited your prospects, and it really flew in the face of why we're going to school and why we're reforming in the first place. But that wasn't the only indicator. So 10 years after Hurricane Katrina, we saw a significant reduction in the Black middle class. And because of the loss of teachers were about 70% dropped down to about 50%. But then you started to see housing prices go up. You started to see employment opportunities dry up, and another number of other indicators that were going in the wrong direction. But my colleagues kept saying, but look at the test scores, they're going up. More and more people were being incarcerated. More and more people had to move because they couldn't afford to stay in the city. And I said, something's wrong with this picture. If the measures for change are pointing in one direction and the actual living of people are going in another. And so I started exploring other factors in the city that pertain to Black folk that are influential in our life trajectory. And I've ultimately discovered that it was those other things that had more to say about the trajectory of a kid's life than what was going on in a school. In fact, so much about the history of New Orleans School Board was about the constant attack against Black children and Black district schools. But yet we characterized everything we did by looking at 2004 and the school board, and just not talking about the decades-long fight against New Orleans public schools. And that just didn't make sense. So I started thinking about this topic because I said, ultimately kids don't live in schools, they live in communities. And we need to figure out ways to enrich the community because schools reside in those places. And if we're hurting the community, ultimately we're hurting schools and ultimately we're hurting students. So that's when I started exploring those other assets in Black communities that we need to invest in.
Taking it back to New Orleans for a minute, the chapter there that you wrote that we owe an apology to students and teachers. Before I even started reading the chapter, I just had tears in my eyes because I guess I had a sense of where it might go. But what apology do we owe students and to teachers?
Well, there is there was a girl at the time by the name of Bridget Green, and I actually don't like using her name all that much because we shamed her out of the city. She was a person that we used to essentially to show how bad the New Orleans school system was. She was a valedictorian, and she could not pass the standardized test. And why that's very suspect. We know that standardized tests don't predict well for what happens to a person later in life. They're horrible predictors of what goes on in the future. They're decent at understanding what a person has taken, but they're just horrible predictors for the future. And we used her, we shamed her, and she and her experience in New Orleans really represented all Black children in New Orleans. This was not about improving the lives of people. It was about advancing reform in spite of people, in the expense of people. We lost her. And because in addition, the firing of the teachers was just horrible. It was just mean. Now, I don't want to get too much in the legality of it, because this went to the state Supreme Court. It was ultimately ruled that the firing was constitutional. But anybody who lived in New Orleans understands that the one thing people needed after the storm was jobs. And we took that away from folks. And that was in the context of shutting down housing for low-income folks, Black people. So we boarded up the projects when we didn't have to, by the way. It was also in the context of police openly shooting folks who were looking for shelter and food. This is in the context of our hospitals being shuttered. All the basic services that Black people needed at the time to serve Black people, we were shutting down. Education was part of that context. We shut out Black women largely because we didn't trust them to move reforms and to transform the city moving forward. We did not trust them. And I say we because I was an ed leader there. And because so few can actually say, I'm sorry, I made a mistake, it was wrong, I will atone by restoring the value that's been extracted by this racism. And it is racism, because wherever you saw reform hit hard, you saw a reduction in Black teachers, you saw a stripping of Black political power in the form of school board. We didn't do this to other districts, to white districts. We would never do that. But we treat Black districts like we treat Black people. We arrest them, we take them over, we do all these things, and it ultimately leads to an investment in whiteness and white people and white-led organizations. There are intermediaries in New Orleans that are essentially middlemen for a public school. And we will throw money in New Schools for New Orleans and other entities instead of investing directly into Black people and organizations. And I have this is not a personal beef against New School for New Orleans and other organizations. However, I know that nothing grows without investment, nothing. And the more you siphon off that investment from the people who need it, you're essentially doing the same sort of, you're operating from the same frameworks as police who choke out people in broad daylight so casually. Oh, you don't need this investment. You know, we can show you how to do this. Choking out the resources for the people who actually need it. And this is going on all across the United States, all across the United States. And I'll just briefly, the book, Know Your Price, to show that we are devalued. I use housing as a way to show it. So I looked at housing prices in Black neighborhoods where the share of the Black population was greater than 50%. And I compared home prices to places where the Black population is less than 1%. But I control for education, crime, walkability, all those fancy Zillow metrics. So I can have an apples to apples comparison between homes in Black areas and homes in white areas. And what we found astounds that homes in Black neighborhoods are devalued by 23%, about 48,000 per home. That amounts to about 156 billion in lost equity all across the country. And we know that 156 billion dollars would be going to sending your kid to college, starting a business. In fact, it would have started more than 4 million Black-owned businesses based on the average amount that Blacks use to start up businesses. It would have funded more than 8 million four-year degrees based on the average cost of a public four-year degree. It would have covered all of Hurricane Katrina damage. It's a big number. And this is taken off the top. And yet this is what we say to districts. Oh, you're not serving students well. We say, oh, it's not about the money. I mean, it's ridiculous. There's no social science research that has dismissed revenue from predictive models of academic success. You can easily argue that ed reform should be more about jobs reform than anything that goes on in a school. You can argue that. But we blamed Black people. And as folks will read in my book, I say this all the time, that there's nothing wrong with Black people that ending racism can't solve. If we fix the structural issues, New Orleans School Board wouldn't have a problem. If we fix the housing issues, New Orleans School Board would have the revenue. If we stop jailing people, we would have more money to actually educate people. We would have more fathers and mothers actually in the economy. There's nothing that says a Black person doesn't belong in an economy like police, like mass incarceration and police killing folks in the middle of the street. You know, these are the issues that are stifling Black education. And let's be clear, this idea of choice is ridiculous. I mean, one, districts have the ability to create layers of choice. We know that. But understand one of the reasons why we got in this mess where Black school districts get less money is because of white choice. They did not want to live or learn with Black people, and we constructed entire finance structures around that white choice. And Black people, everything we've gotten is because of collective action. So from a very philosophical or sort of a value statement, we believe in public school because how we've operated thus far is collective, in the collective. That's how we've advanced. So this notion of we need choice, no, that's a white thing. It's always been. And the impact of that white drive for choice has been segregated communities and schools. And that's what's hurting education today. And we keep blaming teachers. And I say this all the time, when you ignore structural inequality, what you're essentially doing is you have no choice but to blame the Black people. I mean, if you are going to ignore how education is financed, if you're going to ignore jailing system, housing, all that, you have no place to go but to blame Black teachers, blame Black students. And so My goal is to say, you know what? We can actually quantify the wealth that's been extracted by racism. That hundred, those hundreds of billions of dollars we can identify. And that's what we need to be working on and correcting if we want to see change in public schools. Everybody's clear. We want more from public schools. But if I don't care what reform you do, if you don't change these overarching structures, all schools within them will suffer. So we need to address these overarching structures of how schools are financed. I mean, I will say that there's a curriculum issue. White people grow up learning how to be racist. The lack of a proper history curriculum is really hurting Black people because white people aren't getting an education. If there's an achievement gap, let's fix that gap that would lead to someone wanting to vote for a Roy Moore or wanting to vote for a Trump. I mean, these are the achievement gaps in learning that's hurting us ultimately. And so we got to stop this blaming Black folk and building reform on punishing Black people, because that's what it's doing.
Yeah, absolutely. If you're tweeting right now, I need you to tweet that there's nothing wrong with Black people that ending racism can't solve. I highlighted that in the book. I underlined it. And you know what you're saying, Andre, that John actually says this often, is that what we have are policies, loveless policies, right? And communities without love, the way, where we're putting our money demonstrates a lack of love and concern for our young people. The devaluation of assets, you write in the book, affects us physically, psychologically, and economically. Can you talk about the impacts on Black folks, communities of color who are on the receiving side of this devaluation?
Well, one, you're hearing it from the streets when folks are saying we're tired.
Yeah.
What we're tired of is constantly being blamed and punished for things we did not cause. The defunding of schools. And by the way, when folks say, how do you defund the police? We've been defunding schools for quite a long time in many different ways. They should check New Orleans schools on how to defund if they're figuring that out. But the issue for me is that, and John is absolutely right, that there is a lack of care for Black people that comes out in the wash of the research around funding. Now, lots of people have said that you put your money where your mouth is, so to speak. Well, you also put your money where your heart is. And our money is constantly going to whiteness, constantly. The way we fund education. No, and people will say, oh, I will do anything to reform schools, yet I won't touch segregation. I won't touch the way they're funded. I've had so many supposedly progressive folks, say that's too hard. That's too hard. And it's what it's saying is we're not willing to work hard enough for Black people. That's what it's saying. It's saying that we don't trust Black people with money. We don't trust Black people with leadership. That's what it's saying. And so, but these practices are taking revenue from our systems, and when it really comes to policing, it's really taking our lives. And people don't understand how much a wealth extractor the criminal justice system is, on everything. I mean, you're taking wealth out of individuals' pockets, and you're taking wealth out of a community. And you have less money, and policing in general doesn't generate wealth. When you hire a Black teacher, for instance, you're hiring someone who's in the middle class. They're helping to accelerate the human capital of someone else. You're amplifying. So an investment in a Black woman in New Orleans, you're getting much more out of that investment. It's a true investment. When you invest in the criminal justice system, you're investing in something that's going to extract wealth. So my goal with this book is to say, no, there's nothing wrong with our systems if we invest in them, if we remove the drags of racism from housing markets, from education markets, from criminal justice systems, from reproductive, from health systems, if we can take that drag of racism, that disbelief in Black people, then you'll see things work a lot more properly than than the context, or than the context allows them to do today.
So you work in the research space now, and I want to just talk about research a little bit, because you hit on this throughout the book, the power of research and how research agendas are devaluing Black lives. How do we decolonize research?
Let me tell you, one, go get decolonized wealth. You got to get that piece. Very instructive. Helped me understand, particularly the role of philanthropy. So I'm blanking on your question.
We're talking about research, how research is devaluing Black lives.
Well, one of the reasons why I started writing the book is I got so sick and tired of racial disparity research that constantly puts Black people in the position of needing to catch up. That's what the achievement gap is largely about. That it says, hey, in order for us to have parity, Black students must catch up to white students, and that'll get us parity. The problem with that arrangement with racial disparity research, it doesn't encourage investment where it's needed. Again, nothing grows without investment. If education is growing, you need to look for a lack of investment. But it's clear that no one invests in problems. When you say that Black people are here or below white people on a particular measure, without providing the structural reason for it, what you're essentially saying is that Black people are a problem that needs to be fixed. And education is littered with white saviors for this reason. We invest in white people to fix Black people instead of investing in Black people, Black institutions, Black districts, and so you, in your effort to fix people, you're constantly investing in whiteness. And that's what you saw in New Orleans and in other cities all across the country. We're investing in nonprofits to come in and provide a better educational service. We're providing shipping in teachers from everywhere, instead of just investing in the people in a town that really need the investment. And so for me, I challenge my research colleagues all the time to say, hey, we need to research the structures that create the inequality. And we need to show in terms of the measures how much structural inequality is inhibiting Black growth. And so that's what a lot of my research, that it falls in this area of penalty research, or they're underappreciated assets, meaning if you essentially add water, they will grow. They're just not appreciated. But if you notice them and you recognize them and invest in them, they will grow. And so my goal with this book is to say, hey, again, there's nothing wrong with Black people that ending racism can't solve. If you start with that assumption, you have to look for the policies and structures that are causing these disparities. And so let's put a spotlight on the structure, not the disparity, because when you do, all you end up doing is investing in white people to fix Black people. And And we had enough of that fixing. It's clear. And we don't need any more of it at all.
You say in the book that restoring value will require a legislative agenda. So what are some of those policies that you think that will have the greatest impact on devaluing Black properties, or more broadly, what are the values that are the policies that you see we need to reverse the devaluing of Black lives?
Well, that $156 billion in lost equity, I point to a lot because we can actually, there are many different cities where there are devalued properties that people can actually buy if there were mortgage products that allowed them to. Like in places like Detroit, there are thousands of properties that are for sale, available for under 50,000, 30,000. But banks won't back a mortgage that low. And so from a policy standpoint, I believe the same way that we got out of the Great Depression, the same way we get out of a lot of economic hardships, you invest in poor people. It's just that with the New Deal, Blacks were excluded from a large portion of that New Deal. But as we're in this COVID moment, we can actually use low interest home loans, mortgages, as a way to jumpstart communities. There's no way around this. We're going to, in order to improve the wealth and prosperity of folks, there's going to have to be a direct investment in people. I say this is, it won't come through opportunity zones and other mechanisms that are detached from people. If you invest in place and not people, you get gentrification largely. So we need to figure out ways to invest in people. I'm also a big proponent in making sure our state merit scholarships, for instance, actually go to people who need it. You know, I could very easily see a education reparations program for the children of the incarcerated, for instance, people who were denied the opportunity to have wealth. They should be the ones that gets the state merit aid. You know, if we had a racial equity lens, we would figure out ways to distribute resources to the people who need it. Folks, if they read enough, they know that I'm a proponent of reparations. You can call it reparations, or you can call it stimulus. You can call it relief. Any white person that's received any kind of relief because of COVID after being socially distanced for 3 weeks, 3 months, should understand that a people that's been socially distanced for 200 years deserve some relief as well.
Yes.
And so, but the point is, and throughout this book, and obviously throughout the book, I talk about hiring Black teachers. That can be a reform strategy. If you set goals and achieve those goals of hiring Black teachers, and in particular Black women, you can actually help transform an economy and education simultaneously. They'll see in the book that I talk about the added value of Black teachers on education, but what I don't want to go missing is also helps the economy grow and improve. And so there are a bunch of recommendations throughout the book that focus on housing, on education, on reproductive justice. We've got, with Black women who are unable to educate or buy their way to better birthing outcomes, we need structural changes. A lot of research points to places where there's higher incarceration, lower education, worse housing outcomes. You see, understandably, worse birthing outcomes, because hospitals and health are highly connected to the ecosystem that they're in. And so I offer a bunch of reforms that move away from saying, if we can only fix the school, everything will be all right. No, it won't be. Now, we've got to see education, housing, criminal justice, healthcare system as part of an overarching system. And by the way, they are all negatively impacted by structural racism. So if we can uproot those structures that are drags on those systems will be able to thrive. And that's a large part of the point, a lot of the point of the book is to say, there's nothing wrong with us or our institutions. You need to fix the racism.
Absolutely. I only have like a few more questions here. If you guys have questions for Dr. Perry, if you want to begin putting those into the chat, we'll definitely take some of the questions here live in our conversation. What you were just saying, Andre, just really made me think of philanthropy. I think especially education philanthropy is just full of silver bullet ideas to fix fix this problem. What implications for philanthropy does your book offer?
Yeah, I basically say you got to bet on Black if you really want to see growth. There are people in this country that have never received the investment they deserve. And for folks who understand, as you document, a lot of philanthropy was built on oppressing people. That wealth was gotten because of the oppression of people of color. Our Native brothers, our Latino sisters, Latinas, our Southeast Asian folks. We were brutalized, and it was part of the growth model. That's what people don't understand. Like the whole Aunt Jemima removal of Aunt Jemima really shows how much racism is part of the growth model, not only with particular brands, but with the economy as a whole. And so we need to invest in things that actually inspire democracy, that inspire public goods, that inspire collective action. This investment in power, white power, has to stop. I mean, so much when you look at who manages teacher retirements. Let's talk about that. Teachers represent teachers of color represent a significant number of teachers, but they don't show up in terms of who's managing their retirement funds. That's another area of a reform that we got to tackle, because representation matters and who's managing these funds. It determines where they're going to invest and where they're not going to invest. And too often they're not investing in businesses located in places where there's significant Black people. So there's a lot to be gleaned from for philanthropy to say, hey, one, recognize that the wealth that was created often came from negative or oppressive systems. Now you have an obligation to put that money into people who can amplify that investment. And I have to say this, at some point we got to stop investing in whiteness. I hear foundations talk a good game about diversity and inclusion, but when you look at their budget sheets, there's just not an investment in people of color. And I say this, I work at Brookings, a very white institution, and I have no problem with foundations holding us accountable for diversity, because that's the only way it's going to change. Change won't come from me putting out data, even as solid as it may be. It will come when people demand that we defund certain things, and that it comes with a requirement of diversity. And so I think that's what philanthropy needs to learn moving forward, that the calls to defund the police could easily be applied to what they do. Not necessarily defund police, but defund organizations and institutions that have not demonstrated that they can help Black and brown people grow. And if you can't do that, then we need to cut that off. We need to cut it off.
Absolutely. Yeah, and I think, I say often about philanthropy, only 8.5% of philanthropic funding goes to communities of color. So like you're saying, where we put our money really tells the story of our values. I also am reading your book. There were a few philanthropies that you sort of named, and it made me think about, as someone who works in this sector, we could follow your lead and your modeling of actually apologizing. We have misstepped, we have harmed communities at times, we've done wrong, and to take ownership of what we haven't done right, to apologize for that, and then to learn from that and to invest differently and engage in a different type of relationship with communities going forward would be a better way for sure. Before I jump to these questions, just the last thing I want to ask you is, what gives you hope and inspiration? You've been out talking, I see you on social, just everywhere talking about this good work. What do you feel inspired by right now?
Oh man, let me tell you, there are so many doers out there that are working on the right side of justice right now. I mean, regular everyday people are changing the world right now. It didn't come from some technocratic think tanker. It's coming from regular people who are saying, enough, I'm tired. And they're giving me cover now. So when folks are demanding change at the street, I'm like, oh, let me get this research for them. So they can, they're putting pressure that's allowing me to now insert sophisticated data analysis, and give folks information as well. And so I'm inspired by the folks who are saying Black Lives Matter, defund the police, get rid of, choice, the various aspects of choice. You got to be inspired by that, because they're saying what I've been saying, that there's nothing wrong with Black people, that ending racism can't solve. And hey, I wouldn't want to get caught in that crosshair. So folks need to change their tune. They really do. Or the streets will continue to press. I'm writing something now that Black Lives Matter is coming for education. It's coming. And folks need to change up, get the apologies ready, get the change in policy ready, because it's time to trust Black people. And that needs to be reflected in budgets, in our reforms and everything else. So I'm inspired right now.
Awesome. Me too. It's an amazing time to be on the earth in this moment.
Yeah.
I've got some questions from our audience that I'm going to bring up now. The first one says, what is COVID teaching us in this moment to show up differently in ways that value Black lives? And what do we need to reframe in education in this moment?
Well, COVID, if there's anything that we should be learning from COVID, is when our neighbors are sick, then we are vulnerable. And for too long, people of color are sickened by racism. And it's finally catching up to the rest of the country. Now, anyone who understands diversity and inclusion understand that we've been throttling the economy with our racist activities for a long time. We would add more growth, productivity, income if we really invested evenly and democratically in businesses that deserve it. But people are willing to cut their nose to spite their face in order to maintain power and maintain control. Right now, folks are realizing, hey, I need to invest in Black people because they're hurting, and eventually it's hurting all of us. It's hurting a democracy. And so I think this COVID moment helped in many ways highlight the role that structural racism has played. It's literally killing more Black people, COVID is. And we know that COVID doesn't discriminate, but our past policies have, making the spread more likely in Black areas. And so that understanding of structural racism, and then seeing George Floyd killing, I think those two culminate really just did what Selma did in the 60s in terms of exposing to folks who didn't get it, but now it's absolutely clear. If you don't get it, you're just a straight up racist. I mean, I don't, if you can't see that there's been generations of divestment and disenfranchisement in education, in healthcare, in the criminal justice system. And if you don't now see that that has hurt democracy, Black people, then you're completely lost, completely lost. And that's where electoral politics come in. At some point we do need to make changes in our with our government leaders. So vote, get registered if you haven't. We've got to find leaders who are willing to institute the kinds of structural changes that will actually accelerate social and economic mobility.
Amen to that. So a question about why do you think it's hard for white leaders to apologize and atone for their mistakes, or just any advice in general for good white brothers and sisters who might be listening on what they can do in this moment to step up?
I often ask that because when you're privileged, an apology is not all that hard to do. I mean, they're like, when you're privileged, knowing that the thing you might get is, I told you so. It's about time. You were lying. And I mean, you'll get some pushback when you apologize. But from my experience in apologizing, if it's sincere and you atone, people ride with you. I think I've shown, not just with saying I'm sorry, but through my work over time, over these years, people know that my apology was sincere. So for white folks who are that are scared to apologize, I say, apologize, do the work to validate the apology, and you might actually get an invitation to the cookout later on. No, but if you're sitting on the sideline just not saying anything, when everybody and their mother knows that your actions harm people, it's going to be hard for you to step up later.
Absolutely. There's a few comments and questions about your focus on Black women and kind of highlighting Black women throughout your talk. And I noticed on the cover of your book here, to be a Black woman. So could you speak to why the focus on women?
Yeah, after looking at all these assets, it was clear that Black women, the strongest asset is always people, but the things I studied, Black women were in the forefront. So electoral politics, Black women are getting elected in areas that are not Black majority, and at a phenomenal rate. Because they have a vantage point where they can talk about being poor, they can talk about their academic excellence, and so they resonate with Black, white, Latino, other folks in ways that get them elected. So and when you're talking about who should we elect, I'm like, Well, Black women. I mean, let's go there. When you're talking about family, you know, I get very personal about my upbringing. It was a woman who took in me and between 12 and 15 other kids when the economy failed, and at the time Black men weren't getting hired. It was Black women who filled the breach, and took in kids, while policy, and I talk about the Moynihan report a lot. Well, policy essentially said that she was putting me in harm's way because she wasn't didn't have I wasn't raised in a nuclear family, so to speak. But she did more for me than any corporation in Pittsburgh where I grew up. In so many other areas, I saw that women, Black women in particular, were just the most underappreciated asset we have. And I said, you know, I owe a cover. At least the cover needs to reflect that. So there you have it, a Black woman on the cover.
That's awesome. We have another question here, and this must be coming from one of my SHOT colleagues. We've launched a participatory grant-making fund to support police-free schools, to support advocates who reimagined this goal decades ago when it felt impossible. So what words would you share with communities who are contending with this specific issue?
Well, like, policing doesn't drive economic growth. It just doesn't add value in that way. You get much more for the economy, for your student, for your school, if you hired a social worker who knows how to disrupt conflicts. You know, you know, the safety sort of cottage system of the protection. We don't need armed guards in school. I mean, schools, there's a lot said about it because of the rash of gun violence in terms of mass shootings. But schools, by far and away, are some of the safest places for youth to be. And they're made less safe when you have SROs and other police officers, in some cases, slamming kids, sending them to some type of incarceration, encouraging the school to prison pipeline. Police are just not good for schools, and they're not good for the economy as a whole. Yes, if you ask me, do I see a role for police? Yes, but it's going to be a different conception than what we have now. We need a new vision of public safety that will warrant our tax dollars. Right now, we're just not getting a return on investment for policing in schools. And so defund it, because we need money in the schools. So, you know, for me, it's easy math. If you're not getting a return and the returns you're getting are negative, you cut it. And so we need to cut police in schools. We just do.
Absolutely. For the average Joe public out there, whoever that may be, who might be listening today, what's just one thing we can do right now? Like, if we wanna make a difference, what's just one thing we could do to get involved, to begin to support this movement? What are you asking folks?
If I was a white person, I would be looking to join organizations led by Black women, and really take a teaching role, a learning role in that organization, a helper role. You know, this is the time where we should be coming together, and we don't know how to because of our segregated lifestyles. And so I would say, instead of trying to take over an organization, take over a school, you know, try learning at the feet of Black elders and brown elders who learn from them. If you're an aspiring teacher, you know, go to an HBCU, go to a institution that has a significant number of Black students and faculty. Another thing I think we must do is fight this the efforts all around the state to have public funds go towards private schools. You know, we can argue about the legality of it. I think there's more of a moral issue at a time when it's clear that our segregation and our separation has created systems that devalue Black people. We have to return to public systems and public good. And the days of choice and individual choice, you know, that's, you know, we got to problematize that. It's hurting us. You know, it's this, you know, a communitarian perspective, you're always balancing individual freedoms with the collective good. Right now, it's so weighted towards individual stuff that we're forgetting about the collective good. And so I'm like, eliminate these voucher programs that make no sense. And for the charter schools out there, we need a lot less of them, a lot less of them. I've always been, and this is where, you know, some people look at me sideways when I say this. I've always said we need a few schools in every district to do something different, to say we're going to try something new, and we're going to relax the accountability structures, and we need innovation. I think every district needs some kind of I was going to say laboratory, that comes with baggage, but we need a place to try new things. And for me, a charter school could be used in that way. You could put them in between districts and zones that are segregated. You can do interesting things. But right now, what they're used for is to disrupt, to upend traditional districts. And we don't need that. We actually need more resources in underfunded schools. So for me, it's about, hey, we need to transition here. We need to bolster public schools for the public good. We need to work our asses off when it comes to dealing with these segregated systems throughout, including voucher systems. And white people really do need to learn how to follow and listen. And if folks can do that, I think we'll be much better off, particularly in the education space.
Absolutely. Well, we are here at time, and I just want to first thank you, Andre, for sharing your wisdom. I'm fired up after this conversation. I want to encourage everyone, product placement here. If you have not read this book, get this book. It's so good. And it's hot. So I encourage you, support local bookstores, pick it up, and you won't regret that. You know, in closing, I just want to say that we're all declaring Black Lives Matter. Corporations are declaring Black Lives Matter. So what is your next move? SHOT is ready to meet this moment with an opportunity for dynamic support for this police-free schools movement. And we would love to invite everyone on the call to partner with us. Over the past few weeks, we've seen millions of folks demonstrate that where we put our money reflects our values and our priorities. And that statement has been clear that we value Black lives and community-defined safety with this new movement to get police out of our schools. So we're calling on funders, advocates, individual donors to partner with us to deeply invest in education justice advocates and organizers in cities across this country to meet this moment and to win. We have an opportunity right now to support education justice in a way that I have not imagined in my lifetime. We're so close to dismantling the school to prison pipeline. Education justice activists and organizers across the network are leading this movement. We are working hand in hand with the movement to identify the places that we can focus on to support, to replace police and schools with counselors, with nurses, to disband punitive discipline approaches, to replace those with restorative justice practices. What we need is more love and more supports for our students. More information can be found at our website about this fund, which is shotfoundation.org. To continue the conversation, we invite all of you to go there, subscribe to our newsletter, and follow us on social media at Shot Fund to be a part of this movement. And again, we thank you, Andre. We thank you all for joining and being a part of this fantastic conversation today. Thank you. Take care, everyone. Be well.